headlamps carved through the dark like surgical lights, cutting beams across the pine trunks as two men in matching community safety windbreakers clamped their hands around my arms and pushed me deeper into the woods behind Magnolia Crest. Their grip was practiced, too confident for volunteers, too careless for professionals. The night smelled of wet dirt and arrogance. One of them whispered, "Keep walking." The other's flashlight swung back toward the neighborhood like a severed umbilical cord of light. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I want to know what time it is there, because what you're about to hear could have happened anywhere. Your street, your HOA, your own backyard. In the clearing ahead, a folding card table waited beneath the pines like a makeshift altar. On it sat a jurat stamp, a mason jar stuffed with pens, and a crisp HOA letterhead deed transfer already printed with my name in bold black ink. The woman who'd orchestrated all of it stepped into the beam of her own headlamp. Designer trench coat. Cold perfume. A leather portfolio snapped open like the trigger of a pistol. HOA Karen, president, dictator, self-anointed savior of Magnolia Crest, smiled without warmth. "Just sign, Mr. Roar," she said, her voice syrup over gravel. "You'll keep your mailbox. We're not monsters." An owl called somewhere in the trees, a punctuation mark on her insanity. She had no idea my phone, buried in my back pocket, had silently dialed 911 5 minutes earlier. "My name is Mateo Roar. I'm 37, a software architect who builds redundancies for a living, an indifferent lawnmower by necessity, and an espresso purist by religion. I bought my brick ranch on Osprey Loop because I wanted silence, water, and autonomy. But silence is the first thing an HOA takes from you. HOA Karen's reign began with small infractions, letters about aggressive xeriscaping, fines for leaving a trash can visible 11 minutes past pickup, warnings about an American flag she said violated the palette harmony code. She called my native plant garden visual non-compliance. She called my beehive, clearly labeled not bees, an unauthorized livestock structure. Every notice was signed with her trademark closing. Warmly, enforcement. Her obsession mutated into surveillance. She built her private militia, 2 steroidal cousins, Brent and Owen, men who confused intimidation with authority. They patrolled in a golf cart tricked out with red strobes from eBay, clipboards and aviators, muscle and no mind. They called themselves community guardians. Karen called them her boys. The rest of us called them what they were, thugs with a homeowners association budget. I kept paying dues, kept my head down, documenting everything. A habit from my old job. Logs, backups, redundancy. Because systems fail, but data doesn't lie. When the violations stopped working, Karen escalated. She spread whispers that my deed had a recording defect, that I wasn't the rightful owner. It started at her Aqua Zumba class, where gossip flows faster than chlorine. By the next board meeting, she had a PowerPoint titled Reclaiming Our Community from Paperwork Errors. The slide deck showed gavels and castles and a bullet point called Voluntary Deed Corrections. Voluntary, her favorite word. She didn't get the votes she needed, so she built a plan that didn't require votes. That's how I ended up under the trees. Brent stood on my right, clipboard wedged against my ribs. Owen loomed on the left, silent behind his shades, even though the night was black as ink. The air was thick with mosquitoes and malice. The folding table gleamed with moisture. Karen placed a pen at the center like bait. "There's been a recording discrepancy with your property title," she said, almost purring. "If you sign this quick claim, the association will lease your home back to you. 30 years, fully renewable." I laughed. Reflex. Her eyes hardened. Brent's hand moved to my elbow. Too fast, too familiar, and suddenly my own driveway, my own boundary line, blurred into theirs. They called it a private mediation. In legal terms, it was kidnapping with accessories. Here's what HOA Karen never calculated. Quiet men who build software architectures also build contingencies. The second Brent yanked me forward, my smartwatch registered the spike in heart rate, logged the GPS coordinates, and triggered an SOS ping straight to county dispatch. My twin doorbell cameras, angled for redundancy, captured every second. Brent's grip, Owen's block, Karen's order. Get him to the trees where we can handle this properly. My ShedCam picked up the convoy across the lawn. My dashcam recorded the table setup in the woods. Every move, every breath, stored, time-stamped, cloud-synced. And because fate occasionally has a sense of humor, my neighbor Ruth, a retired postal inspector with nerves of steel, was watering her succulents and filming the entire procession on her tablet in glorious 4K. Karen leaned closer now, perfume choking the air. "No pressure, Mr. Rohr," she whispered, "but we can't guarantee security patrol response times if you refuse our generous offer tonight." Her patrol stood beside her, hands flexing, their eBay sirens winking in the distance like cheap halos. For a moment, I could see how she'd fooled them. The illusion of power, the language of regulation twisted into personal law. The HOA isn't about community, it's about control disguised as civility. That's when the forest lit up. 2 beams cut through the trees, real flashlights, white and cold. "Hands where we can see them," a deputy barked. Brent froze, clipboard halfway up like a shield. Owen's mouth opened, but no sound came. Karen straightened, smoothing her trench coat, already rehearsing a lie. "We're licensed. Community safety officers," Brent stammered. The taller deputy's tone was pure surgical calm. "Is that your patrol vehicle?" he asked, nodding toward the modified golf cart with its homemade strobe lights. Karen tried to interject, but I was already holding out my phone. "Here's the text," I said. "Bring your government ID, we'll handle the recording. Sent 3 hours ago." The deputy's eyebrows rose. That single emoji carried more weight than any affidavit. Within minutes, everything flipped. Evidence bags appeared. The notary stamp, confiscated. The pens, bagged. The letterhead deed, tagged. Karen's boys were separated, wrists trembling under the deputy's flashlight. One officer asked the rhinestone-covered notary if she understood what she'd done. "Notarizing under duress is a crime," he said. "You've just joined a felony co-op." She started crying so hard the rhinestones fell from her phone case. The deputies radioed the county recorder's office, and even the night clerk couldn't hide her glee. "An HOA can't seize property through intimidation," she said over the speaker. "Tell them the only thing they're recording tonight is evidence." Karen's voice cracked. "This was a mediation session," she insisted. The deputy turned his light on the headlamp gear, the jar of pens, and the pre-printed deed with my name in 24-point Arial. "You mediate in the clubhouse," he said flatly, "not in the woods." The rest unfolded like clockwork. Brent and Owen were read their rights. Karen went silent, staring at her manicure as if she could file down the consequences. My phone kept vibrating in my pocket. Ruth texting me updates from her porch. "Got it all, sweetie. Audio too." By the time we walked out of those woods, the illusion of power had evaporated. The so-called enforcers were sitting on the ground, hands cuffed. HOA Karen's trench coat speckled with dirt and panic. The deputies escorted me back across the lawn, and I looked once over my shoulder at the scene. The folding table, the mason jar, the ridiculous pageantry of control collapsed under its own weight. The story would spread before sunrise. The footage would go viral before lunch. But in that moment, standing on my own property again, I realized something sharper. Karen's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating the law, it was underestimating documentation. Systems fail, evidence endures. And this time, every frame of her empire was already uploading to the cloud. Before that night in the woods, I thought HOA Karen's madness was limited to letters, fines, and gossip. I thought bureaucracy had limits. I was wrong. Looking back, I can see how every decision I made, the cameras, the files, the habits that people laughed at, were the reason she didn't win. Every system I built came from the same place. Preparation. When you design software for a living, you learn that failure isn't an accident. It's engineered by oversight. You anticipate what can go wrong, and you build backups for when it does. That's how I lived. That's how I survived Magnolia Crest. The first time I saw her, she was standing in front of the community clubhouse, clipboard tucked under one arm like a badge. Her hair was perfectly sculpted, her smile rehearsed. She introduced herself as President Pike, but the neighborhood already had another name for her, HOA Karen. She had a way of speaking that sounded polite, but landed like a summons. Her sentences came preloaded with implied fines. She had moved into the neighborhood 5 years before me, and had turned the HOA from a volunteer committee into a private regime. Most people learned to nod, smile, and stay out of her crosshairs. The few who didn't ended up paying for it in letters, citations, and threats of liens. When I bought my house, the previous owner handed me a thin blue folder labeled Covenants. He said it like a curse. Inside were dozens of pages of microcontrol disguised as community order, no unapproved paint colors, no visible garden structures, no deviation from the landscape palette approved in 2003. It wasn't law. It was performance. Karen enforced every paragraph like scripture. At first, I ignored it. I didn't care what she thought of my lawn or my choice of flag, but indifference only fueled her. The HOA thrives on participation, and ignoring her rules was a greater act of rebellion than arguing. When I received my first violation letter, I thought it was a mistake. Aggressive xeriscaping, it read, as if I'd planted landmines instead of wildflowers. The second letter accused me of housing unregistered livestock because of the bee box I'd labeled for pollinators. The third claimed my mailbox height deviated from neighborhood standards. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. Each letter carried her digital signature, Karen Pike, President, Magnolia Crest Homeowners Association, and below it, her motto, preserving property values through accountability. It was a brand, and I was her unwanted case study. I sent polite replies, backed by citations from county code. I learned the language of regulation quickly. My background made it easy. Before software, I'd spent 6 years contracted to a federal systems agency, building compliance tools for property and asset registries. I understood documentation chains, timestamps, and audit trails. The kind of things HOA Karens depend on others not knowing. Every response I sent was written like a technical report, numbered paragraphs, references to state statutes, polite tone, unassailable logic. She hated it. Control doesn't survive when its target speaks the same bureaucratic dialect. Within months, my house became her obsession. She escalated from letters to personal inspections. Her golf cart patrol circled like a hawk every morning at 7:30. Brent and Owen rode shotgun, taking photos of my driveway like paparazzi. Once, I caught her measuring my hedge with a tape, muttering to herself. I filmed it from the window and archived it under Evidence 003. Every image went into a private folder synced across 3 encrypted drives. People laughed when I told them I kept redundant cameras, but redundancy is discipline. The more she pushed, the quieter I became. Quiet unnerves authoritarians. It means you're recording. My reputation in the neighborhood shifted from target to anomaly. The older residents avoided eye contact. They'd been fined too many times to risk it. A few younger ones started to nod in respect. One afternoon, a neighbor named Marcus stopped by with his sprinkler invoice. Karen had fined him for water waste. He asked how I fought her notices. I showed him the simplest defense: documentation. I taught him to photograph his meter before and after watering, to timestamp the images, to log them with the county's water use schedule. Within 2 weeks, his fine vanished. He left a note on my porch that said, "You made her back down." That was the first time I realized information could dismantle fear faster than confrontation. But authority isn't just knowing laws, it's using them like a scalpel. I began to study HOA statutes at night. Title transfers, lien processes, board voting procedures, property escrow rules. They read like code, full of loopholes and vulnerabilities. I marked every clause Karen had misapplied. I learned that an HOA has no standing to question county-recorded deeds. I found the specific statute she violated each time she threatened to reclaim property. Each discovery felt like a weapon sharpened. Karen's background was pure theater. She'd worked in marketing before her self-appointment as neighborhood savior. She loved optics, despised scrutiny. Her power came from appearance. People assumed her threats had legal weight because she delivered them with confidence. But confidence isn't jurisdiction. She once told a neighbor, "The county answers to the HOA." I had to bite my tongue not to laugh. The county doesn't answer to anyone. It documents. That's the difference between arrogance and authority. I started keeping a secondary file labeled Karen's Commandments. Each entry recorded one overreach: dates, subjects, consequences, violation letters, rumors, even her public statements at board meetings. It wasn't petty, it was procedural. I wanted a record of pattern and intent, not emotion. Every bureaucratic tyrant leaves fingerprints. You just have to collect them quietly until they form a map. When she introduced the Community Guardians program, I knew she was escalating. The official memo claimed it was for enhanced neighborhood safety, but there was no vote, no budget allocation, no insurance rider. That meant she'd acted alone. It also meant liability rested entirely on her signature. She'd given 2 untrained relatives authority to patrol property lines. They wore windbreakers printed with "safety" in reflective letters, but the only safety they enforced was hers. I started cross-referencing their names with county licensing databases. No security permits, no background checks. What they were doing was technically impersonating law enforcement, another statute violation added to my file. It wasn't fear that drove me. It was precision. Fear clouds judgment. Precision creates leverage. Every night I'd back up footage, log every incident, write brief summaries with timestamps and GPS coordinates. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was building an archive so thorough that when the system collapsed, it would bury her in her own documentation. That's what authority looks like. Not yelling, not intimidation, but quiet competence. The kind that scares people like HOA Karen because it doesn't flinch. Every tyrant depends on emotional reaction. It justifies their enforcement. The moment you stop reacting, their system stalls. The final trigger came in an email. The subject line read, "Recording defect. Immediate action required." She accused me of squatting on my own property and demanded I cooperate with a title correction initiative. The email contained a form already filled out with my name and a section labeled "Signature for Voluntary Transfer." That was the moment I knew it wasn't about power anymore. It was about theft. She wanted my deed, not my compliance. I spent the next 48 hours preparing like a technician setting a trap. Every camera tested, every backup verified, every automation checked. I even updated the SOS sequence on my smartwatch to trigger a simultaneous cloud upload and alert dispatch. I didn't expect violence, but I planned for it. Because planning is survival. By the time her guards arrived that Thursday evening, everything was live, every recording device armed, every feed secured off-site. Even the neighbor across the street knew something was off. Ruth sent me a single text before it began. "They're setting up lights by the tree line." She wasn't wrong. People think authority comes from titles, uniforms, or legal jargon. It doesn't. Authority is discipline under pressure. It's knowing which systems matter when everything starts to fall apart. Karen thought she could orchestrate fear under cover of night. I knew that the law, when documented, doesn't sleep. That's the foundation of what followed. The reason I didn't panic when they grabbed my arm. The reason I didn't scream when they led me into the woods. I wasn't being dragged into her domain. She was walking straight into mine. HOA Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant with a clipboard. She was an architect of manipulation, a politician hiding behind neighborhood bylaws. Her entire empire rested on perception. Authority without legitimacy. Enforcement without oversight. To dismantle her, I first had to understand how she built her power. Magnolia Crest wasn't a community. It was her stage. Every rule she created was written not to protect the neighborhood, but to cement her control. She crafted her image like a brand. Karen Pike, protector of order. Her photo hung in the clubhouse above the mission statement she wrote herself, a paragraph that could have doubled as propaganda. "Harmony through compliance," it read. The problem was that compliance had turned into submission, and nobody noticed until it was too late. The HOA meetings told the story. Rows of homeowners sat silent while Karen orchestrated the agenda like a conductor guiding an orchestra that feared her baton. Every vote passed by nods, not voices. Her vice president, a timid man named Paul, agreed with everything she said before she even said it. The treasurer, her friend from the country club, handled the books with the precision of someone who didn't want anyone else touching them. And the guardians, Brent and Owen, stood by the door like bouncers in matching jackets, ensuring no one lingered after Karen adjourned the meeting. Her control wasn't about democracy. It was about spectacle, order performed, not practiced. Her rise began years before I moved in. When Magnolia Crest first formed, the HOA was voluntary, a small group of retirees collecting modest dues to maintain the entrance, landscaping, and streetlights. Karen arrived during a period of apathy. The board's paperwork had lapsed, the president had resigned, and nobody volunteered to take over. She stepped in, filing the renewal forms herself, rewriting sections of the bylaws under the guise of modernization. In the process, she inserted clauses that consolidated power, extended presidential terms, emergency authority to issue fines without a vote, and the right to hire auxiliary enforcement personnel. It was a hostile takeover executed with a fountain pen. By the time the other homeowners realized, it was too late. The association was a legal machine, and she was its operator. Her political network extended beyond Magnolia Crest. Karen attended county planning meetings, schmoozed with mid-level clerks, and occasionally donated to campaigns for code enforcement supervisors. She'd learned early that proximity to bureaucracy gives the illusion of legality. Whenever someone challenged her, she'd drop a name or mention a friend at the recorder's office, as if she had invisible backing. The truth was simpler. She had a Rolodex of acquaintances she'd intimidated into silence or indebtedness. Her charm wasn't charisma, it was leverage disguised as grace. I discovered her financial ties the same way I uncover bugs in code, trace dependencies. Every policy she enforced led back to a personal interest. The landscaping company she used for HOA grounds maintenance, owned by her cousin. The printing service for violation notices, run by her friend from church. Even the Community Guardians program had invoices, funneled through her own consulting business, cleverly named Covenant Solutions LLC. She'd written contracts to pay herself under different titles: advisor, coordinator, compliance consultant. Each transaction hidden behind jargon so boring it guaranteed nobody would read it. Her relationship with the local police was performative too. She loved name-dropping the sheriff's department, but her coordination meetings were just public safety briefings open to anyone. Yet she spun those brief encounters into narratives of partnership. She'd tell homeowners, "Law enforcement supports our initiatives," as if her HOA carried the weight of a municipal agency. The board meetings echoed her delusion, parroting phrases like "our jurisdiction" and "community code authority." The deeper I read into the HOA's paperwork, the clearer it became that her legal understanding was a facade. She relied on fear and confusion because clarity would have exposed her as a fraud. The people she targeted weren't random. She chose them with precision. Single homeowners, retirees, newcomers, anyone without local roots or energy to fight back. She'd start small, a violation letter here, a rumor there, until fatigue replaced resistance. Once you complied, you became silent. Once you stayed silent, you became part of her proof that her system worked. That's how she kept the rest of the neighborhood compliant, through selective enforcement disguised as fairness. I interviewed several homeowners quietly, under the guise of neighborly conversation. They all told the same story. At some point, she'd issued a citation that didn't make sense. Some paid the fine out of exhaustion. Others sold their homes. No one had ever beaten her in a documented dispute. Karen's secret weapon was paperwork. She flooded the county recorder's office with forms, amendments, and notices, so many that clerks often processed them without scrutiny. She weaponized bureaucracy's fatigue. Every HOA revision she filed was accompanied by dense legal phrasing and tiny font, designed to dissuade reading. But I read every word. Buried in an amendment from 2 years prior was her emergency quiet title provision, a paragraph that granted the HOA authority to resolve ownership discrepancies in the interest of community stability. It was meaningless jargon with no legal standing, but it sounded official. And that's all she needed, the sound of legality. What fascinated me wasn't her boldness, but her certainty. She truly believed she was untouchable. That's what made her dangerous. She'd turned the HOA into a cult of paperwork and image. Her loyalists defended her because they feared what non-compliance looked like. She manipulated their self-image, convincing them that obedience equaled integrity. It was psychological warfare disguised as civic duty. Then came her next evolution, the Quiet Title Initiative. It was supposed to target old deeds, properties she claimed had filing inconsistencies. In reality, it was a predatory mechanism aimed at homeowners she wanted gone. She disguised it as community cleanup, saying it would strengthen property values. During one meeting, she compared it to pruning a garden. You have to cut away the overgrowth to let healthy roots thrive. She smiled when she said it. I was sitting in the back row, watching her sell tyranny like landscaping advice. But her system had cracks. I found them in the details she overlooked. For all her vanity, she wasn't meticulous. Her financial filings were sloppy. Her meeting minutes had timestamps that didn't match the audio recordings I quietly captured. She'd often approve motions that never reached quorum. The deeper I dug, the clearer her blueprint became. She didn't just abuse power. She built a framework that replicated abuse automatically. Her bylaws were code for corruption. By midsummer, her pattern was undeniable. She had issued more fines and property warnings than the previous 3 boards combined. The HOA account, which once held a modest reserve for maintenance, was hemorrhaging money on administrative expenses. Meanwhile, Karen flaunted new jewelry, new cars, and out-of-town training conferences. The board justified it as leadership investment. They were too scared to admit what everyone already knew. Karen was bleeding the community dry. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Ruth, my retired postal inspector neighbor, had seen her type before. "They all crumble," she told me one afternoon, handing me a cup of coffee. "They just need documentation to push them over." She wasn't wrong. Every empire built on ego eventually collapses under the weight of its own paperwork. What kept Karen afloat was her confidence. She'd stand at the clubhouse podium, waving her manicured hand as if conducting a symphony of compliance. "We're protecting our investments," she'd say. But I saw it differently. She wasn't protecting, she was praying. Her rules weren't fences, they were cages. When she began circulating whispers that my deed was unverified, I realized she'd chosen me as her next example. She needed a public spectacle, a demonstration of power to keep the rest afraid. She didn't anticipate that I'd already built the kind of redundancy she couldn't bully. I wasn't her next target. I was her final one. Behind the smile and trench coat, HOA Karen's empire was nothing more than paper scaffolding, thin, fragile, and one legal gust away from collapse. And I was about to bring the storm. Everything about Karen's empire looked solid from the outside. Paperwork, signatures, titles, but it was all scaffolding. Hollow structure masquerading as strength. The deeper I went into her filings, the more fractures appeared. I wasn't angry anymore. I was analytical. That's the moment you stop being prey and start being the system that swallows the predator whole. Every HOA tyrant counts on people to get tired, to stop reading, to give up on understanding the legal jargon. I decided to go the other direction. I would learn it better than her, better than the county clerk, better than her so-called consultants. The first discovery came from a simple audit of her language. She loved official-sounding phrases: community asset stabilization, voluntary correction initiative, provisional enforcement clause. None of these existed in any statute. They were words she made up to sound like law. I verified it against the state code library and confirmed what I suspected. She'd invented her own legal lexicon and printed it on HOA letterhead to confuse homeowners. It was fraud disguised as formality. I printed every document, highlighted every misuse, and started cataloging them into a cross-reference chart linking her terminology to their actual legal definitions. The goal wasn't to confront her with it yet. It was to establish pattern and intent. Then I started tracing her filings with the county recorder. Each HOA is required to log amendments, property liens, and board resolutions through the recorder's office. Karen had done that, but inconsistently. Some documents were properly filed, others existed only in the HOA's own binder. That meant they were never legally enforceable. I submitted a public records request for every document Magnolia Crest had filed under her presidency. It took 2 weeks, but when the envelope arrived, I spent a night laying them out across my dining table like crime scene evidence. There were 37 filings. 12 were missing signatures. 9 had altered timestamps. 3 referenced resolutions that had never passed in any recorded minutes. It was a blueprint for deception, and I could see the architecture of it now. Flood the system with so much pseudo-legal noise that no one could tell what was legitimate. Most people wouldn't know how to check, but I did. Each anomaly became a data point, and data builds narratives the way truth builds gravity. It pulls everything toward the inevitable collapse. The next discovery came from a different channel entirely. I filed a request under the state's Open Records Act for any correspondence between Magnolia Crest HOA and county agencies. It was a gamble, but it paid off. There were emails, dozens of them. Karen had been corresponding with a mid-level clerk in the property division, trying to persuade him that several homes had erroneous title recordings. Her messages were full of charm at first, then insistence, then veiled threats. One line stood out. If we don't correct these ownership records, the community could lose credibility and property value. It wasn't just overreach. It was a written attempt to manipulate a public office into facilitating fraud. I forwarded the emails to a friend I trusted, a former paralegal who'd worked for a title insurance company. She confirmed what I suspected. She's trying to execute a quiet title action without authority, my friend said. If she got someone to sign, it would technically look like a voluntary transfer unless you could prove coercion. That was the missing piece. Karen wasn't just abusing power. She was rehearsing real estate theft. She'd already tried to steal my property on paper. The woods were just her final escalation when the paperwork didn't scare me. I turned my focus to the Community Guardians program. On paper, it was a security patrol. In practice, it was a liability nightmare. I searched the state's licensing database. No record of either Brent or Owen holding any security credentials. I checked the HOA insurance policy and found another irregularity. The policy excluded coverage for criminal or unauthorized enforcement activity. That meant if her guards assaulted anyone or damaged property, the HOA wouldn't be protected. She'd exposed the entire community to risk, all for the illusion of authority. I drafted a memo summarizing it, citing the specific state statute that defined impersonation of law enforcement. The citation was precise enough to make any attorney nervous. The digital evidence came next. I synchronized all my camera feeds, doorbell, shed, dashcam, even my interior monitor system, and stitched together a timeline of the night she crossed the line. Every clip, every frame was time-stamped and hashed for integrity. I mirrored it on 3 separate drives and uploaded encrypted copies to cloud servers under separate accounts. It wasn't paranoia, it was procedure. Evidence unbacked is evidence waiting to disappear. Ruth's footage filled the one blind spot my cameras couldn't cover. She had filmed from her porch, capturing their approach the moment they grabbed me and their path through the trees. Her video even caught Karen's voice saying, "Get him where we can handle this properly." That line alone turned the event from intimidation into kidnapping. I extracted the audio, cleaned it, and sent a copy to the Sheriff's Department's Digital Forensics Division. They authenticated the time signature within 24 hours. The county had its proof. While the investigation began, I built a second campaign. Paper to counter paper. I drafted a complaint to the state HOA Oversight Division. I cited 32 separate violations of governance procedure, including failure to hold open meetings, unapproved spending, falsified votes, and unauthorized legal actions. Each claim was supported by exhibits, screenshots, audio transcripts, board minutes, and certified mail receipts. I numbered every document, created an index, and mailed it registered to 3 agencies: the Oversight Division, the State Notary Board, and the County Ethics Office. Karen had always counted on her opponent's exhaustion. She never planned for someone with infinite patience. The Sheriff's Department reached out within a week. They wanted a formal statement and copies of all my footage. I met the lead investigator at the county office. He was calm, methodical, and visibly amused by the absurdity of it all. "She really tried to notarize a deed in the woods?" he asked. "At night?" I nodded. He shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "Well, she notarized herself right into 3 different felonies." I handed over my copies and chain of custody logs. He smiled. "You built this like a case file. Makes my job easy." While law enforcement moved on the criminal side, the administrative machinery began to grind forward. The State Notary Board suspended Mandy's commission within 48 hours. The Oversight Division opened an audit into Magnolia Crest's finances. The Ethics Office launched a parallel investigation into Karen's consulting contracts. The County Recorder's Office issued a formal notice stating that no HOA may alter property ownership without judicial approval. The dominoes had started falling, one bureaucratic filing at a time. The real artistry of taking down an HOA tyrant isn't outrage, it's precision. It's using the same system they abuse and turning it into their prison. Every email, every recording, every statute became a lock on the door of her collapse. The more documentation I sent, the more impossible her defense became. Karen tried to pivot. She sent a mass email to the neighborhood claiming misinformation and character assassination. She wrote that I had doctored footage to discredit her. But truth moves faster than damage control when documentation backs it. The sheriff's department confirmed the footage as authentic. The county clerk's office issued a public statement clarifying that no property defect existed for my address. Her credibility evaporated overnight. And still, I wasn't finished. I filed one more motion, a request to the county to appoint a temporary receiver over Magnolia Crest's financial accounts, citing mismanagement under emergency provisions. It wasn't vindictive, it was logical. The law gives authority to the organized, not the loud. When you build your case with precision, emotion becomes irrelevant. By the end of the second week, Karen's legal firewall was in ruins. The sheriff's deputies were coordinating with the district attorney's office. The oversight division's investigator had frozen the HOA's discretionary budget. Even the insurance company rescinded their policy, citing criminal exposure beyond policy terms. I'd built a system she couldn't escape, a web made entirely of her own paperwork, her own words, her own signatures. She'd weaponized bureaucracy, and now it was turning on her with the precision of a clock striking midnight. When I lay in bed that night, the air finally still, the only sound was the low hum of my server uploading one last file. The final time-stamped evidence log labeled, Case, Magnolia Crest, completed. The glow from the monitor reflected off the walls, steady and cold. I thought about how easy it is for people like her to win when no one documents, when no one fights back with patience. Then I thought about the first letter she'd ever sent me, the one about my flowers, and smiled. Her downfall began with that sentence. She'd built an empire on paper. I'd used the same paper to end it. The days after my evidence submission were quiet, but it was the kind of silence that vibrated with tension. Karen's empire wasn't built to survive scrutiny, and now that scrutiny had a badge. I watched it unravel in slow motion. The first sign came on a Monday morning when Brent's golf cart disappeared from its usual patrol route. By noon, a tow truck had hauled it away at the sheriff's request. The second came when a county records van parked in front of Karen's house, and two investigators stepped out with briefcases and official jackets. The third came in whispers from neighbors. Karen had been calling emergency board meetings in a panic, claiming she was the victim of a digital smear campaign. The narrative was slipping from her control, and she could feel it. I didn't engage, I didn't need to. The sheriff's office and state agencies were doing the heavy lifting now. My job was done, except for one final thing. Truth needs witnesses. I made sure everyone who'd lived under her thumb saw what accountability looked like. I handed copies of the county's public notice to neighbors who had been fined or harassed. It stated in clear legal text that Magnolia Crest's leadership was under investigation for criminal misconduct and governance violations. People started talking again, openly this time. For the first time in years, the neighborhood silence cracked. Karen tried to fight back with her favorite weapon: presentation. She called for an emergency homeowner briefing at the clubhouse that Thursday night. The flyer read, Community Stability Meeting Protecting Our Reputation. It was pure damage control. I went not to argue, but to watch. The clubhouse was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Rows of folding chairs filled the hall, the air humming with curiosity and unease. Karen stood at the front, wearing her signature trench coat, flanked by her two guardians, now dressed in civilian clothes. Her smile was stretched thin, the kind that trembles under its own weight. "Friends," she began, her tone overly calm, "there's been some unfortunate confusion. Certain individuals are circulating false accusations about our leadership, but rest assured, your board remains committed to transparency and order." The room was still. I could feel the shift in energy. The same crowd that once feared her now smelled weakness. She continued talking, layering reassurance over denial, pretending nothing had changed. But it had. Everyone had seen the news segment that aired that morning. The local station ran the footage Ruth had sent to the sheriff's office. Brent and Owen leading me into the woods, Karen standing by the folding table. The headline was simple: HOA president accused of coercion attempt. There was no defending that image. When she finished her speech, I raised my hand. Her eyes met mine, sharp but desperate. "Yes, Mr. Rohr?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Since you are so committed to transparency," I said, "would you like to explain the video?" The murmurs started immediately. Someone pulled out their phone and played the clip on speaker. Karen's voice echoed through the room. "Get him to the trees where we can handle this properly." The sound of it filled the hall like a confession. Her composure cracked. "That audio was taken out of context," she said quickly. "We were conducting a mediation." The laughter that followed was quiet, but deadly. Nobody believed her anymore. The vice president, Paul, stood up from the front row and cleared his throat. "Karen," he said, "I think it's time we adjourn. The board can't function under investigation." For the first time, she didn't have a script ready. She stammered something about loyalty, about misunderstanding, but the meeting was already dissolving around her. People began standing, whispering, shaking their heads. The illusion of power she'd maintained for years was collapsing right there under fluorescent lights. By the next morning, the investigation had gone public. Local media published excerpts from the sheriff's report. The notary's confession was included, word for word. Mandy admitted under oath that she'd been paid $200 in cash to bring her notary stamp for a community matter. The evidence was overwhelming. The emails, the texts, the footage, the fabricated HOA provisions. It all converged into one brutal conclusion. Karen Pike had turned a homeowners association into a criminal operation. When the deputies arrived at her house with the warrant, half the neighborhood gathered at a distance. I stayed on my porch, coffee in hand, watching as the reality of her downfall played out. She emerged still trying to look composed, but her hands trembled as they cuffed her. The designer trench coat she'd worn as armor now looked absurd under the flashing lights. Brent and Owen followed next, heads down, their self-appointed authority evaporated. The deputies read the charges aloud: attempted coercion, false imprisonment, conspiracy to file fraudulent instruments, impersonation of security officers. Every word landed like a nail sealing a coffin. The media frenzy lasted days. Reporters parked vans along Osprey Loop, interviewing neighbors about the night in the woods. Ruth's quote made every article. They were about to notarize a tree. It became a symbol of small-town corruption, an absurd story that embodied everything wrong with unchecked power. Magnolia Crest became infamous overnight, but not for its manicured lawns or community pride, for the spectacle of its leader's collapse. But the chaos wasn't over. Karen's allies tried to salvage the association. The treasurer resigned after being questioned about missing funds. The vice president announced a special election. The county froze all HOA accounts pending audit. What had been her private kingdom was now a disassembled machine of bureaucracy under forensic inspection. The same rules she'd used to intimidate others were being used to dismantle her creation. Even as the legal wheels turned, she refused to admit fault. In her initial court appearance, she stood before the judge and claimed she'd been misunderstood in her commitment to community order. The judge wasn't moved. The prosecution presented her emails, her fake provisions, her text messages, every thread of deception woven into a perfect noose. Her bond was set at $50,000. The courtroom spectators gasped. For the first time, she didn't speak. For someone who had controlled every room she entered, silence was her most revealing confession. Meanwhile, Magnolia Crest began to breathe again. Without her shadow, neighbors stepped forward to share their own stories. One woman revealed that Karen had fined her for porch clutter because of her child's bicycle. Another admitted she'd been threatened with foreclosure over a misplaced flower pot. Each testimony was a piece of the mosaic showing how deep the rot had gone. The HOA had been built to protect, but under Karen, it had become a mechanism of fear. Now that fear was gone, replaced by collective clarity. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The media's spotlight forced county officials to review other HOAs in the district. 2 more investigations opened. Karen's story became a case study in overreach and accountability. She'd tried to bury me with paperwork. Now she was buried by her own signatures. I didn't gloat. Revenge doesn't need volume, it needs precision. Watching her empire fall apart piece by piece was satisfaction enough. I knew what came next. The audits, the hearings, the quiet dismantling of every bylaw she'd abused. It was slow, methodical justice, the kind that doesn't make headlines after the first week, but never stops working in the background. That night, I walked past the woods where she'd tried to take my property. The clearing was empty now, the table gone, the ground still scarred where her arrogance had stood. I looked up at the sky, listened to the wind through the trees, and felt something I hadn't felt since moving to Magnolia Crest. Peace. The kind that isn't granted by authority, but reclaimed through truth. Karen thought she could control a neighborhood through fear. What she didn't understand was that fear loses its power once it's documented. Evidence turns fear into fact, and facts destroy tyrants. By the time the last news truck drove away, she was just another name in a court docket, another headline that faded into history. But for the people who lived there, for me, she was the lesson carved into our collective memory. No one owns a community through intimidation, not while someone's still recording. The morning after Karen's arrest, Magnolia Crest looked like a crime scene wrapped in caution tape. But what came next wasn't chaos. It was control reclaimed. The county's emergency receiver arrived at the clubhouse with a briefcase, a deputy escort, and the authority of the state behind him. His name was Samuel Gray, a financial auditor with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a man who dismantled empires before. Within the first hour, he had the HOA accounts frozen, the files sealed, and the locks changed. The residents stood outside watching through the glass doors as years of Karen's rule were boxed up into evidence cartons. I was there, standing beside Ruth, watching order return to the same place where Karen had built her illusion of it. Gray moved methodically through every drawer, labeling and logging each document. I could tell by his posture that he'd already seen enough to suspect embezzlement. Later that afternoon, I was called into a meeting with him and a representative from the state HOA Oversight Division. They wanted to understand how this all began. I brought my documentation, the violation letters, the digital backups, the video timelines, even the notarized affidavit I'd filed after the Woods incident. Gray leafed through it silently, pausing only to nod. "This is the most thorough citizen case file I've ever seen," he said finally. "You built her prosecution before we even got here." The retaliation wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about repair. The Oversight Division appointed an interim board made up of 5 homeowners, including Ruth and Marcus. They were tasked with rebuilding the association under supervision. The first act was the repeal of every illegal amendment Karen had passed. The second was opening the financial ledgers. That's where the truth metastasized into numbers. Gray's audit uncovered tens of thousands of dollars labeled as consulting fees, all paid to Covenant Solutions LLC, Karen's private company. Another $15,000 had been routed to her cousin's landscaping firm for special maintenance projects that never happened. Even the Community Guardians program had drawn funds from an insurance claim that had never been approved. It was a fraud mosaic, painted in invoices and forged approvals. Gray compiled his findings into a report that read like a federal indictment. He handed it directly to the district attorney's office, which folded it into the criminal case. The HOA's insurance company followed immediately, canceling coverage and filing a separate civil suit to recover losses. The same system Karen had used to intimidate homeowners was now feeding her into its gears. Bureaucracy had turned on its architect. My involvement deepened when the Oversight Division asked me to testify at the administrative hearing. They wanted an insider's account of how she manipulated procedure. The hearing took place in a cold, echoing room at the County Civic Center. Karen sat at one table with her attorney, avoiding my eyes. I was sworn in, then asked to describe the sequence leading to the night in the woods. I spoke clearly, without anger, detailing her pattern of escalation, the illegal patrols, and her attempt to coerce a signature under duress. Her attorney objected twice, citing irrelevance, but the presiding officer overruled both. Evidence doesn't need emotion, it needs precision, and precision was something Karen couldn't defend against. When I was done, I handed over the exhibits, video stills, timestamps, her own emails. Each piece of proof landed on the table like a hammer strike. When they played the audio of her voice from Ruth's recording, the room went silent. It was the same sentence that had haunted her since that night. "Get him to the trees where we can handle this properly." The presiding officer leaned forward. "Ms. Pike," he said, "do you understand this statement alone satisfies the element of intent under state coercion statutes?" Karen's lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't answer. That was the moment the illusion of control she'd built for years disintegrated completely. The administrative verdict came a week later. Karen Pike was permanently banned from holding any position in a homeowners association within the state. She was fined the full restitution amount equal to every dollar she had misappropriated. Her notary accomplice, Mandy, lost her commission and was referred for prosecution. Brent and Owen were sentenced to probation, community service, and a mandatory course on lawful security conduct. The HOA itself was placed under a 2-year state receivership with financial supervision and quarterly audits. Magnolia Crest was finally out of Karen's hands and under the cold, unflinching custody of law. But the retaliation didn't end in courtrooms. It extended into policy. The county board, under pressure from the public exposure, began drafting new legislation to regulate HOA power limits. They proposed mandatory transparency measures, public access to meeting recordings, and penalties for unauthorized fines. What had started as one neighborhood's nightmare was evolving into statewide reform. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who weaponized bureaucracy had inspired its evolution. When reporters came back for follow-up coverage, I declined interviews. I'd said everything that needed to be said in affidavits and evidence logs. Ruth gave one quote to a local journalist that summed it up better than I ever could. "He didn't fight her with fists. He fought her with receipts." The story spread across news networks, not as a scandal, but as a case study. Law schools discussed it in seminars about property law and abuse of governance. For once, Magnolia Crest's name wasn't synonymous with fear. It was a symbol of resilience. There was one final moment of confrontation I hadn't anticipated. A month before her trial, Karen requested a mediation session, a legal formality to negotiate damages before sentencing. I didn't need to attend, but I did. The meeting was held in a conference room at the county courthouse. She sat across the table, no trench coat, no clipboard, just a plain gray suit and eyes that had lost their predatory confidence. She looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. For years, she'd filled every space she entered with authority. Now she barely filled the chair. "I never meant for it to go that far," she said, her voice quiet. "You don't understand what it's like trying to keep a community together." I met her gaze without flinching. "You didn't keep it together," I said. "You held it hostage." She looked away, blinking hard. "I thought I was protecting it," she murmured. "You were protecting yourself," I replied, "and the moment you made it personal, it stopped being community." There was nothing more to say. She signed the settlement agreement, civil liability, full restitution, acknowledgement of misconduct. For a woman obsessed with signatures, that was the one that finally ended her story. Afterward, I walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. I passed reporters waiting for a statement, but I kept walking. Retaliation doesn't need applause. It needs closure. I'd achieved both. The law had done what it was designed to do. It absorbed the chaos, processed it, and delivered consequence with precision. When I returned to Magnolia Crest, the signs of recovery were everywhere. The lawns were overgrown but peaceful. The clubhouse door now bore a temporary seal reading "Under Audit." No one feared the knock of enforcement anymore. Neighbors greeted each other again. Kids played in driveways. For the first time since I'd moved there, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not the one who ruled it. Karen's name became a ghost in the minutes of the next board meeting. Mentioned once, then struck from record. Her reign was over, her influence erased by the very paperwork she'd weaponized. The HOA, stripped to its bare function, was starting fresh. And for me, the man she tried to dispossess, retaliation had never been about destruction. It was about restoration, the quiet rebuilding of what fear had dismantled. That's what real power is. Not control, not domination, but the ability to turn injustice into structure, chaos into precedent. Karen thought she was the system. What she never understood was that the system always outlasts the person pretending to control it. The weeks that followed the trial felt unreal. Magnolia Crest, once a polished cage of conformity, became something human again. The HOA no longer existed as an instrument of fear, but as a structure stripped bare, reset to what it should have been from the start. A cooperative of neighbors, not a throne for one woman's ego. The emergency receiver completed his work, and by the third month, the county declared the community financially solvent again. The new board, Ruth as president, Marcus as treasurer, and 3 other residents who'd once lived in quiet dread, adopted transparency as a creed. Every meeting was recorded, every vote documented, every expenditure published in a shared online ledger. Nothing hidden, nothing whispered. The ghost of Karen's regime still lingered in the clubhouse, but her power had been erased by paper stronger than hers, truth authenticated by law. I stayed on the sidelines at first, watching, listening. The new HOA mailed me a formal apology letter signed by the interim board and the county receiver. It wasn't necessary, but I kept it anyway. It symbolized something rare: acknowledgement. Accountability had completed its cycle. The same community that once turned its eyes away from injustice had finally opened them. The silence that Karen had cultivated was gone, replaced by conversation, by laughter, by the faint sound of normal life resuming after years of bureaucratic captivity. When the restitution payment arrived, it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the document itself, stamped and certified by the court, with her name below mine. Defendant, Karen Pike. It was more than a settlement. It was closure inked in legal permanence. I framed it not out of pride, but as a reminder. Systems are only as strong as the people willing to defend them. Her trial made the state news for weeks. The footage of the arrest replayed on screens across the county. Commentators called it the suburban scandal of the decade. Law firms wrote case briefs analyzing the fallout, and policy students dissected how a neighborhood coup evolved into a precedent-setting prosecution. Karen had become a case number, a cautionary tale cited in legal lectures about governance abuse. The woman who once strutted through cul-de-sacs wielding bylaws like weapons was now serving 18 months in state custody, her name stripped from every county record except the ones that proved her guilt. I visited the woods only once after everything ended. The clearing was overgrown again, grass reclaiming the space where a folding table had once stood. The memory of that night had already started fading, replaced by something quieter, stronger. I stood there as twilight fell, the light turning gold through the trees, and thought about what the sheriff had said during the last interview. People like her don't believe rules apply to them until the system reminds them who wrote them. He was right. Laws aren't weapons, they're mirrors. They reflect what people choose to be when power tempts them. Karen saw control. I saw consequence. Magnolia Crest held its first legitimate election 6 months later. No hidden agendas, no backroom amendments, no intimidation, just neighbors, ballots, and order restored. Ruth called me that night. "You should have seen it," she said, her voice bright with disbelief. People clapped when the meeting ended. Nobody was afraid anymore. That single sentence felt heavier than any verdict. Freedom rarely announces itself with fireworks. Sometimes it's just a sigh released by people who finally feel safe again. I wasn't looking for recognition, but the county sent me a commendation for extraordinary civic contribution. I didn't frame that one. It stayed in a drawer with the other papers that told the story. Violation letters, screenshots, court notices. Together they weren't just evidence. They were history. A chronology of what happens when ordinary citizens decide not to bow to ordinary corruption. Karen's house sold quietly after her conviction. A young family moved in. A couple with 2 children and a golden retriever. They repainted the door, planted roses where she once displayed warning signs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman obsessed with enforcing aesthetics had her legacy replaced by color. The same neighbors she'd fined for trivialities brought casseroles to welcome the newcomers. That was the final restoration. Not legal, but human. As for me, I didn't move away. I'd thought about it once, but leaving would have meant surrendering the peace I'd fought for. Instead, I rebuilt my garden. The native wildflowers she once called non-compliant bloomed across the yard, vibrant and defiant. Every petal was proof that her authority was dead, and nature, like truth, always reclaims its ground. Sometimes at night, I'd sit on my porch, the one she'd called unsightly, and watch the porch lights flicker on across the neighborhood. No patrols, no fines, no fear, just families living, kids laughing, sprinklers whispering in rhythm with the hum of quiet order. The kind of peace you can't legislate, but only earn. Karen Pike's name remained on the county's criminal docket for a long time. Even after she served her sentence, she tried appealing her ban from HOA positions, but the appellate judge denied it without hesitation. Community governance is a privilege, the opinion read, and those who corrupt it for personal gain forfeit that privilege forever. That ruling became known informally as the Magnolia Principle, a doctrine reaffirming that homeowner associations are accountable under the same laws they wield. The state legislature codified parts of it the following year. Karen's arrogance had changed the law itself, but not the way she'd intended. In the end, her punishment wasn't the prison or the restitution. It was erasure. The community she'd controlled forgot her faster than she believed possible. Her legacy reduced to a single line in a legal database, and the faint echo of a name that no longer inspired fear. Power had devoured itself. I often think back to that night, the cold metal of Brent's grip, the glare of the headlamps, the sound of her voice commanding compliance under the trees. Then I think of the moment the deputies stepped from the darkness and the law illuminated every lie she'd built. That's the memory I keep, the pivot between oppression and justice. Magnolia Crest thrives now. The bylaws are rewritten, the audits are clean, and the HOA, once a weapon, has become what it was always meant to be, an agreement among equals. Neighbors handle disputes with conversation instead of citations. No one needs approval to hang a flag or plant a flower. The lawns aren't uniform anymore. They're alive, imperfect, human. That's what victory looks like. Not revenge, not humiliation, but balance restored. The paperwork that once enslaved us now protects us. The cameras that once guarded me now gathered dust, unnecessary but still there, like monuments to vigilance. I kept the glitter from Ruth's video, the shimmer of her porch light catching dust in the lens, and turned it into a framed photograph that hangs beside my desk. It's a reminder that order without empathy becomes tyranny, and that justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't shout. It simply stands in the daylight, quiet and undeniable. Karen thought she could control a neighborhood. What she didn't understand was that communities, like truth, always find their way back to the light. Magnolia Crest did. And so did I.